So hello and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this special webinar. My name is Shimrit Braun Kamin. I'm J Street Northwest Director, Regional Director, and today marks 30 years since the rally in Tel Aviv that changed Israel's history. November 4th, 1995, I think every Israeli remember where they were at when they heard that Prime Minister Rabin has been murdered. I'm sure many of you on this call remember it vividly as well. I was there that night at the big rally titled Yes for Peace, No to Violence. I was only 15, and I can still feel how meaningful that evening was. In the months before, I went almost every Saturday to Kikar Malchei Israel back then, to the rallies in support of peace and in support of the Oslo agreements. But that rally on November 4th felt incredibly special. It was so crowded, filled with music and hope and people that really believe that we are moving towards a real change. And as we all know, the euphoria at the rally quickly turned into a big devastation. As I was walking back to the bus with my friends back then, it was not far away from where it happened, and I heard the 3 shots. I'm still shaken when I'm saying it because it was really chilling moment. I can feel up until today. And that was a moment that changed my life and unfortunately changed the trajectory of the state of Israel. And we are really privileged to have with us today 2 people in Rabin, worked with him and continue to carry his legacy in their work. Aaron David Miller, one of the country's foremost experts on US policy and Middle East and Israel-Palestine conflict. He is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has advised secretaries of state on both parties in shaping America's policy in the region for more than 2 decades. Aaron is joining us from DC. Thank you for being here. And Yael Patir, Israeli policy expert and former J Street Israel director. In her previous role, Yael advised for the European Union delegation to Israel and served as senior diplomacy advisor to the Israeli Minister of Regional Cooperation. Yael is joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you again for both of you for being here. And before we dive into the conversation, I want to share what we hope to explore together today. First, we'll look back to learn more about Rabin's leadership and vision and what it was like to work alongside the leaders whose voice of courage is so deeply missed today. Then we'll look forward to ask how we can reclaim the story and values that the right wing has worked so hard to erase. And most importantly, we'll reflect on what Rabin's legacy teaches us 30 years later about how we can keep working together here at our J Street community and beyond toward a future of peace, security, and hope for everyone in the region. So let's start with going back 30 years. Both of you have memories with Yitzhak Rabin. And before we analyze the politics and legacy, I'd like to ask you to share something personal. Aaron, you knew Rabin for 30 years, first for your parents and through Rabin's family, and then as working with him next to tables that really changed history. And I wanted you to start and share, how was it the first time? How was it like to meet Rabin for the first time, if you remember?
First of all, thanks, Shimrit, and it's great to be here with you, and J Street does extraordinary work. I wanted to make sure to mention that. I did have a personal connection with Rabin. My parents knew him well. My father had befriended Yitzhak in the wake of the '67 war. My mother got to know Leah as well, and my mother, I mentioned to both of you, actually attended Yuval Rabin's bar mitzvah in Washington, Washington, D.C. at Adas, Israel. I met Rabin, strangely enough, in Jerusalem for the first time, and then in Tel Aviv in April of 1974. I had decided, I was at the University of Michigan studying Civil War history. I convinced my committee that if I could pass reading tests in Hebrew and Arabic and learn 2 new fields, would they let me get a PhD in Middle Eastern history? So we packed up, Lindsay and I, and moved to Jerusalem the war broke out October 6, 73, until now, the greatest intelligence failure and trauma that had befallen the state of Israel. Golda Meir won an election in December and then was forced out of power in April by the State Commission of Inquiry, which is sorely needed. An interim report, which didn't even target Meir as being responsible for the intelligence failure. She was forced to resign under public pressure. And first week in April, Rabin was elected, became prime minister in June. I was invited, Lindsay and I were invited to a Seder at Rabin's apartment in Tel Aviv. And I remember it's first time I actually had a chance to talk to him. Sitting directly across from him, he asked me, he knew I was working on a PhD in Middle Eastern history. He asked me what I thought of Anwar Sadat and Egypt. And against my better judgment, I answered the question. I went on for far too long. And he looked at me finally after a minute or two. And with his hand in that familiar dismissive wave that I would grow to learn so well, looked at me directly and said, "You know nothing about Egypt and very little about the Egyptian-Israeli relationship." And I remember turning to Lindsay, didn't have much to say for the rest of the Seder, but what struck me about Rabin was his directness, his bluntness. He was shy and extremely wary of small talk. He was a counterintuitive politician. And it was that authenticity and the fact that he is the first Israeli prime minister to be born in Israel that began to create the sort of foundation of trust and confidence that would allow him to return to the prime ministry with much greater confidence than he had had during his earlier years.
And first of all, thank you for sharing. This is incredible, and I can see Rabin in my eyes when you describe him. What stand out for most of you when you remember him also as a leader, a negotiator? Any moment or anecdote that captures who he was?
Again, it's Rabin's directness. In March of '93, Rabin, when he came to Washington, would always meet with the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher at the time, but he'd also schedule a session with the Prime Minister, with some of the members of our negotiating team. This was at the Washington Hilton. I think in '93, they had a non-smoking policy, didn't bother the Prime Minister. He lit up one cigarette after another. Sam Lewis, a former ambassador to Israel, asked Rabin the question. This was March of '93. It was, yes, the secret contacts were underway, but no decision had been made to formalize the Oslo Channel, which ultimately happened later that spring. But Sam Lewis asked the Prime Minister, "Look, Mr. Prime Minister, West Bankers clearly cannot represent Palestinians in negotiations, and the Jordanians are too weak to do it. How are you going to deal with the problem of Palestinian representation?" And Rabin's analysis, he didn't say, "We are now engaged in an informal channel with the PLO," but he led all of us to believe that his own views had changed. And at some point, it was quite clear to all of us that he would authorize, as he later did, to formalize the Oslo Channel and to break a longstanding taboo, which, as the Oslo process lies in bloodied, battered, or in tatters just about everywhere, the one remaining extraordinary remnant is the reality of direct contact with the organizational embodiment of Palestinian nationalism, the PLO. Rabin had the courage and the foresight, I think, to understand, however difficult Arafat was as a partner, more on that later, Rabin understood the politics and was willing to change his own views. And it was that capacity to change that I think was the most extraordinary dimension of the journey Rabin took.
Thank you. And we'll touch more about this change later because it's really meaningful. And I want to refer to you, Yael. You've spent much of your career advancing the kind of peace Rabin's envisioned. And can you share your story of your first memory and connection to Rabin and how his leadership shaped your career up until today?
So really happy to be here and always, to be home at J Street, and an honor to speak alongside Aaron David Miller, which I think is one of these people who if you asked me years ago, who do I want to be? So it's like Aaron David Miller in a woman. It's kind of an option. Unfortunately, not an American. So, that position of being the mediators was never available to me. But my story, Shimrit, is very similar to yours, and also telling that we're the same age, because I was also 15 when I participated at the rally, so exactly the same age. And what I want to share is that in the last few days, there's been a lot of, obviously, movies and podcasts and articles and videos and the rally last Saturday. And I've noticed, like, I stopped to notice that every time I hear the 3 shots and the message broadcasted from outside the hospital, right, the Prime Minister is dead, I burst into tears. And it's been 30 years and the feeling hasn't changed. And today I kind of thought about it and I realized that it's trauma. Because I think before October 7th, I didn't really understand like trauma and national trauma and how something that is a national event can be so personal. But today, when I was crying for probably like the 30th or I don't know 20th time in the last 48 hours, I realized that there's like real trauma there, and it's a trauma of a young woman that is a believer that is in a place that she understands that she's going to this rally because she's fighting for something. And we know famously that Rabin didn't want the rally to take place because he was worried that nobody is going to come. The kind of public atmosphere that he was absorbing was one that led him to think that the square would be empty. And it was really the other people and Shimon Peres and others that convinced him that this, that we have to do something that shows the public support. And he eventually was convinced. And the stories that people around him tell is that he was very surprised at the event to see the amount of people and the energy, Shimrit, that you described, which was really electrifying. And I really remember as a teenager going to the square with an Israeli flag, understanding that there's a fight between 2 camps in Israel, and I'm going to kind of claim my space as a patriotic Israeli that is willing to compromise, right? That nobody's going to take my flag. I took this big flag that, the same flag that we go in the past 3 years to demonstrations with, to say, this is an act of patriotism. So the sense was very strong that there's this strong wave and against Rabin's actions, policy, and so that's, I wanted to share that very kind of authentic feeling as a young person that wasn't in the secret rooms or didn't have the opportunity to meet Rabin in person, and probably if he was still alive and I had my career, so I would have been marked with the rivals camp, because my career started with the Shimon Peres Center for Peace, and I worked with Shimon Peres and Rabin and Peres. We can talk about it a little bit later, but they were like, the greatest enemies. But I wanted to take a minute to really talk about, the personal trauma, and how 30 years have passed, but it's still like within the blood and the bones. This sense that something was done to you, to your dreams, to your aspirations, to your belief.
Yes, I can. So I can feel every word you're saying, and it makes so much sense to me as well, and to my own experience. And talking about that, I wanted to walk with you back to the months and days ahead of the assassination, because I think it's really important to unpack, and it's very relevant for today to understand what was happening back then, because it didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after months of incitement of the Israeli right wing, including figures who unfortunately today are in the Israeli cabinet and leading Israel. So Yael, I wanted to ask you if you can share with us what you remember from the atmosphere in the lead up to the assassination.
Sure. So I mean, as I said, and it's important for me to just put myself kind of in the context for everybody to understand. I was a person that goes to peace demonstration as a 14-year-old or 15-year-old, but I wasn't super, super well versed reading the newspapers every day. I was like your regular teenager. And still, the experience of the incitement was very present. I mean, it was not something that happened kind of in one place, and that you could avoid or you could not know about. There was a mass mobilization movement against the Oslo process, against the government, and it was through activists and rabbis and political leaders. People rallied and demonstrated and chanted death to Rabin. They put up mock funerals with a cascade, I think is the correct word, with Rabin's sign on it. There were posters showing the Prime Minister in SS uniform. I mean, it was very, and it was also physically violent. Like I remember cars crashing into demonstrators. I mean, there was also a lot of violence around these demonstrations. And the last point that I want to make, and maybe it will be a good segue to Aaron, is that what was happening in Israel also happened in the US, not to the same extent, but the same kind of mobilization, and we can talk about Netanyahu's responsibility. But the one thing that I can really put on Netanyahu's shoulder is that during this period, he was lobbying in the US with the Jewish community and with Congress against the prime minister. So a lot of times we have this argument of what are you allowed to do as opposition in Israel? Are you allowed to oppose the government's policies outside of Israel? It's important for me to mention this, because this mobilization of opposition to the government was not only happening in Israel, it was also happening in the US. And it was very strategic and to an extent successful. I mean, Israeli politicians from the government that were in events in the US there was a lot of attacks organized, demonstrators within Jewish gatherings and so on. So that was the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I want to ask both of you, we have to talk about Netanyahu. As you said, he has become the face of Rabin's opposition, attending rallies and all the terrible rallies you described. He was the front face. And today, 30 years later, Netanyahu's coalition, including people like Ben Gvir, that we all remember also his famous footage of holding like the little symbol from Rabin's Cadillac, saying we've reached into his car, we'll get into Rabin. And I want to ask you if we can draw a line between the atmosphere that led to Rabin's assassination to the political atmosphere we see in Israel today. It's kind of tie up everything you talked about, Yael, also.
I mean, I'd venture a few thoughts here. I don't know about the causality. Clearly, Yigal Amir was responsible for killing Rabin. Netanyahu clearly, at least one rally, did almost nothing, may even have indirectly encouraged those chants. I think at one point, Netanyahu actually did say, I don't know if he used the words demonized the prime minister, but clearly that atmosphere was critically important, but it was not the proximate cause of Rabin's murder, which was not inevitable. I mean, Rabin did not want to wear a bulletproof vest. Rabin balked at the idea of importing this large Cadillac. He was much more comfortable, I think, in the Chevy Capri that his security had been driving. 2 years before the assassination, Yigal Amir and Rabin were at the wedding of, I think, the chief rabbi, daughter of the chief rabbi of Israel. And I think Amir later testified he was there with his brother, and Amir was armed. He had a weapon, and in his own mind, he turned over the issue of whether or not he should try to kill the prime minister then and there, and decided not to. And again, books have been written. I'd recommend one, To Kill a King by Dana Fran, who's now one of my editors at Foreign Policy, which delves into the security lapses with respect to killing the prime minister. I would like to pick up on just one point that Yael made, and that is, it's an urban legend that we don't intervene in Israeli politics and they don't intercede in ours. The fact is, we do. Both of us do. I had a ringside seat when George H.W. Bush and James Baker decided to deny then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir housing loan guarantees. That was one of the reasons Rabin won in June of 1992. Bill Clinton actively campaigned for Shimon Peres in the spring of 1996, inviting him to the White House a month or so before those June elections. Netanyahu won anyway. And you've seen it again in an extraordinary demonstration of intervention with the current president addressing the Knesset, turning to President Herzog and basically campaigning for a pardon for the prime minister, and again, a 60 Minutes interview. So this notion that we don't play each other's politics, however it seems to me risky it is, it happens, and it's going to continue. Netanyahu, years ago, decided the evangelical community in the United States, the conservative community in the United States, and conservative American Jews were a much more important constituency for him than to deal with the divisions within the American Jewish community as a whole. And he has basically emerged, I think, as a understanding that the Republican Party in America today is the Israel right or wrong party, despite a few MAGA influencers, which have been critical of the Israelis. So this has been ongoing for a good deal of time. And unfortunately, it is eroding the one element, in my judgment, that is critically important for the survival of a healthy U.S.-Israeli relationship, and that is bipartisanship. There are at least three different views of Israel that I could identify in Washington today among political elites. It's extremely unhealthy. Donald Trump has enabled this, and so has the current prime minister, who was the longest governing prime minister, as you know, in the history of the country.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll definitely want to touch more also on what it later on the conversation, what it means today when Trump says peace versus what we talk about when we talk about Rabin. It's really, I really want to hear your take on it. And Yael, I want to go back to you and ask, and I think Aaron, I would like to hear also if you have anything to add on that. In the years after, we've seen the Israeli society going back to Israelis, particularly the peace camp. Do you think they have been processed or maybe failed to process the consequences of the assassination?
I think, using the word trauma is very significant. Rabin's assassination for the left in Israel, and more broadly, let's say the left is the peace camp, and then there's a broader, what we call now the democratic camp. The assassination is an open wound, and it's a wound that feeds a lot of the anger towards Netanyahu and the rejection of Netanyahu, and also this sense that democracy was like stolen, right? That the assassination kind of changed the rules of the game, and I think that one of the things that I don't know if it's a failure or not, but one of the ways in which the Israeli society tried to process the Rabin assassination throughout the years could be seen if you kind of analyze, and it would be now that I think about it an interesting PhD, if you analyze the rallies, the Rabin memorial rallies, like if you go 30 years back and you look at the rally each year. And one of the things that was always like a struggle is that, and I think, Aaron really touched upon that when he said that it was Yigal Amir, who factually killed the king, right? But the peace camp, which again still has this wound, accused very clearly Netanyahu's camp, because not only did he not stop the incitement or called against it, he then also won the elections. So he kind of stole the leadership in a way. And then throughout the years, as I said, if you look at the rally every year, throughout the years, it was always this push and pull to kind of take like a strong peace supportive, Oslo supportive, peace process stand between that and between this unity stand. So, we understand that one of the outcomes of the Rabin assassination is that it kind of pushed the two camps away. It created this it's both sides have the responsibility to kind of find the middle ground, to find each other, and therefore the rallies throughout the years, it was always a back and forth. I hope I'm managing to explain it, but I think that part of, like, if you're asking about how Israeli society processes it, so part of the processing was this continued questions of how did we reach the point of such violence? How did we reach the point of such incitement? And I remind you that the rally where Rabin was assassinated was yes for peace, no to violence. It wasn't yes for peace, no to annexation, or no to greater Israel, or something like that. And in a way, I feel that we're still stuck there, you know? We're still stuck in this push and pull between like wanting to be united and like losing the ideology, losing the message, losing the path forward, and then moving to having clarity on the path, on the two-state solution, on land for peace, and so on, but then losing the broader public. So that's one element of it that I would highlight.
No, I think that's really very insightful. I just in thinking about today, 30 years later, a couple points need to be made. Number one, and I realize this is not a heretical comment, speaking before a J Street audience, but one thing that is unmistakably clear: the history of peacemaking in Israel is a history of the right and the center right. Menachem Begin made a deal to return Sinai, so that in essence he could also lay claim and keep what he believed to be the ultimate prize, which was the West Bank in Jerusalem. Rabin was a man of the center right, not of the left. He earned the epithet the breaker of bones during the first Intifada. I remember him well in meetings with then Secretary of State Baker, how tough-minded Rabin was. Sharon's decision to disengage from Gaza in 2005 was another example of a right-wing leader who had the authenticity and power to make these decisions. And not to give him credit which is not due, but Benjamin Netanyahu, despite saying that he would never sit with Yasser Arafat, never, signed two agreements. One, the Hebron Protocol in February of 1997, and a second, the Wye River Memorandum, in which he sat with Arafat. So this strain has got to be readily acknowledged. Whether the headline is the trend line or not, I don't know. But it is the center right. And I just add one other anecdote. On the 10th anniversary of Rabin's murder, I was in Israel, and I had a meeting with Ariel Sharon, who had been pretty critical of the things that I had been saying about him, but wanted to make sure, and he and Rabin were close. I remember attending a Druze wedding in early 74, again, as Rabin's guest, and who should appear? A much slimmer Ariel Sharon. The two of them understood one another, and Sharon told me on the 10th anniversary of Rabin's murder that the left had hijacked Rabin, and the left had said things in Rabin's name with respect to dividing Jerusalem, for example, that Rabin would never have accepted. I pushed back and I said to Sharon, leaders evolve, people change. But I think it's really, really important, however hard, politically inconvenient it may be to admit, that most of the agreements reached between Israel and its neighbors were reached as a consequence of right-wing and center-right politicians. Just one additional point. When I look back now, I realize how special the years 1993 to 2000 were. Amir killed Rabin, but in killing Rabin, he turned whatever hope and potential there was in a highly flawed process of Oslo for many reasons. He fractured and eliminated, and Rabin made it clear to us, he couldn't stand Arafat, but he realized that Arafat had done hard things himself, and he respected Arafat for that. Taking Rabin out of the equation set events in motion that, despite American efforts from 96 to 99 to save them, save what was left of the peace process, really killed it. Because by the time Barak and Arafat got to Camp David in July of 2000, there was no trust, there was no confidence. And those 2 weeks, which was the only time an American president brought an empowered PLO leader who did have a monopoly on the forces of violence in Palestinian society, even though at times he chose to unleash those forces, and a risk-ready prime minister, Ehud Barak, together. It's never happened before, to Camp David. And by the time those 12, 13 days were over, the gaps on borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, end of all conflict and claims were wider than the Grand Canyon. And today, they are galactic in size. Yigal Amir has no regrets. Hopefully, life sentences in Israel sometimes get turned into pardons. Yeah, Amir killed far more than Rabin and succeeded in doing everything he wanted to do, which was to make a pathway for Israelis and Palestinians that much more difficult. Sorry to drone on, but it's really a sad and tragic observation. And what it shows is the power of individuals, the powers to take away a life like Rabin, but to put Rabin into history. And we can talk at some point, maybe should, about what might have happened had Rabin not been killed. Again, I apologize for going on and on.
I want to add like two short
Yeah.
points just to, one is that, I don't know if you're aware, but if you just tune in to the media outlets that are the media outlets that represent the right wing in Israel, the current coalition, Channel 14, Makor Rishon, there's a TV channel, there's newspapers, you would hear that October 7th happened because of Oslo. Okay? So, I mean, in terms of the narrative, I mean, you're very right about the right wing being right wing leaders being the ones that, did the compromises and so on. But still, in our, if we talk about how we process what happened, the common narrative in the right today is that the greatest disaster in the history of Israel happened because of something that happened 30 years ago and was Rabin's fault.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to say when I say that the wound is very open and very bleeding until today, and we still live within the same kind of rhetoric and narratives, and yeah, okay. I'll say the other point maybe later.
Thanks, Yael. I think it was really important.
Yeah. And Aaron, I really want to touch on what you said now about how we can deal with, it's important to touch a little bit on the complexity of dealing with Rabin's legacy, because he was a military commander and he led brutal campaigns against Palestinians. And then later in his life, really turned into a man who believed that Israel's security and future can only be achieved by peace. And mostly for the younger generation who can look at Oslo now in a very critical eye, I think touching this moment of the shift that Rabin made and what led him to really develop this trust with Arafat and the ability to go towards such a bold move
Right. I mean, again, I will say that the summer of 1993 was a very critical summer. The informal Oslo channel had been in train since December of 92, Ron Pundak and Yair Hirschfeld. Rabin made a decision in May, I believe it was in May, to turn that unofficial channel into a formal one.
Which he didn't know about at the beginning.
Right. And tasked Shimon Peres and Uri Savir with managing it. When Warren Christopher came to Israel in July, Rabin told him flat out, I am willing to withdraw from the entire Golan Heights if Syrian President Assad meets our needs. We took that offer to Assad, who temporized, was suspicious, and did not respond the way Rabin had hoped. Rabin's preference, frankly, for the reasons that Shimrit and Yael know well, was to do a deal with Assad, to skip over the complexities of Jerusalem, the right of return, all of that. Assad said no. And when Christopher briefed Rabin, Rabin was disappointed, but it was at that moment that the focus shifted to whether or not the formal Oslo channel could create a declaration of principles, which ultimately it did by August, and then you had the signing on the White House lawn. The Palestinian track was not Rabin's preference, but I think he realized its importance. Because Rabin's conception was, in order to deal with what he believed to be the real existential threat to Israel, Iran and Islamic fundamentalism, what he described as the outer tier of Israel's security challenges, you really did need to deal with the internal circle. And that meant reaching an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And I think Rabin came to understand as Minister of Defense during the first Intifada, 89 to almost throughout 91, that there was no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was one hugely important conversion from a tough-minded Israeli prime minister and security chief of staff. And the second was the one I alluded to earlier, that King Hussein would have been too vulnerable and could not represent Palestinians in a negotiation. The West Bankers and Gazans were too divided and too beholden to the PLO. And the only way to do this deal was to engage in a political process that ultimately would have to address the organizational embodiment of Palestinian nationalism, which was the Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat. That sort of complexity, that to me is the most extraordinary thing about Rabin. It gives me hope that, in essence, a leader, having tethered himself or herself to very tough-minded and long-held positions, could actually change. Jimmy Carter told me the same thing about Begin. He thinks Carter believed that Begin's traveled a much greater distance to part with Sinai than even Sadat did in his willingness to travel to Jerusalem in November of 1977. So again, I'm struck by the power of individuals. In this case, Rabin, to start a process, and tragically, cruelly, Yigal Amir, to end one.
Yes, no, there is no way to silver lining. Yael, I just want to, like, in this line, I wanted to turn to you, like, touching a little bit more on the lines of Rabin's change and your last work in the Israeli government. Can you share the shift you also made? And it's all really relevant when we talk about the upcoming election in Israel, the shift you made with the Palestinian citizens of Israel and the partnership with them.
Sure, but let me just say a few. I see that we're like starting to run,
Yes.
out of time. So, but I just concerning Rabin's complex legacy, I want to touch on two things. I think one, which is very important to mention, is that 30 years ago, and the Oslo process, and from Rabin's point of view, he never said, and I don't know what he thought because I can't get into his head, but Palestinian state was never something that that he said or saw. He always said that the Jordan Valley will be the border of Israel. Aaron mentioned before Jerusalem, Barak went like way forward with the idea of some sort of shared custody and partition. So just to say, when we look at Rabin's legacy, for me, the fact that he was, an officer and a gentleman is kind of the Israeli man. We are like a state of a military state of fighters. It's not, the fact that he was a security tough guy is not something that I can hold against him. It's part of the DNA of who we are and what we have to deal with. But I think it's important to say that during the Oslo period, and that summer that we refer to, the people who were saying Palestinian state were the right that were against Oslo. So the fact that it was then, years, that year afterwards, it was sort of adopted. It was a departure when from where Rabin was. That's one thing I wanted to say about his legacy. And the other thing that I wanted to say about his legacy, yes, he thought that dealing with refugees in Jerusalem and all these like very difficult issues is something that is too difficult, and that's why Oslo was an interim agreement. But the other issue that was very, very difficult was to deal with the settlers. And there Rabin wasn't brave enough. And and also Shimon Peres. I mean, when Rabin was prime minister, he had the opportunity during after the Goldstein massacre to evacuate Hebron, which he did not do. And I think that could have tilted the scales, or could have created a reality where the settler movement is much more contained than what we see today. So that's just 2 points that I wanted to make. Regarding the question of what do we see today, and you asked about the government that they served in.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch about the fact that he really he brought the Israeli Arab parties into to work with him towards the Oslo agreements. And I just wanted you to say a few words about his partnership with the Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Right. So it was the first time that Arab parties were cooperating with the coalition. They weren't part of the coalition, as was the case in the government that I served in, what we call the change government, the previous government, but they were a bloc, meaning that they would vote with the coalition for policies and they basically allowed for the policies of the government to take place, and of Rabin's government, and in return they got a lot of benefits that they didn't get before, mainly budgets and sort of the attention of the administration, and less more equity in resources. Still very long way from where it should have been, but that was certainly revolutionary, and kind of a moment that we look for inspiration a few decades later, when the previous government was made. But it was also, again, history repeats itself, but it was also back then a source of criticism towards Rabin's government, that it's promoting policies using not using a Jewish majority in a way.
Thank you. So I really I think there's so many things to unpack, and of course we won't be able to touch anything. And I wanted us to start to move towards closing with looking ahead. Yael, first of all, for you, you participated this Saturday. There was a big rally in memory of 30 years for Rabin. For the first time in 5 years that his rally was held with 150,000 people. And they chanted, like I watched it from home, and it was amazing to see people chanting again, yes to peace, no to violence. And I think the word peace was not in the Israeli public discourse for a long time, especially not after October 7th. And suddenly we heard it, and we heard people cheering when Witkoff said it on the Hostel Square a few weeks ago, and in Rabin Square this Saturday. And I want to ask you, Yael, do you feel like from being there on Saturday, does it feel like a real awakening? Does it felt different this year from previous years?
First of all, it felt like Saturday evening is finally, available for a peace demonstration. Saturday evening is the evening where we hold the big rallies and demonstrations in Tel Aviv, and it was occupied for years with other agendas, and and it was this opening. Like I'm being cynical, but it's also telling. I think that people are, really eager, looking, searching for hope. The audience didn't feel very different than the audience that I was part of in the hostages demonstrations or in demonstration against the judicial hall. But it's kind of back to the source in a way. I don't know if it's an awakening. I think it's a longing for peace in the broadest sense possible, but also in the very immediate sense of no war. And it was very exciting to be there, and interesting to see kind of the three leaders that were on stage, and who got the most claps and what messages they brought to stage. What are the narratives that they're putting forward that will probably be part of their campaign. But I would take it with a grain of salt. I think it was a moment of kind of the camp coming together and supporting each other, and looking right to left and feeling that you're not alone, but not in the sense that there's like political power and peace in the peace agenda at the moment.
Yeah, this is a complicated moment. And Aaron, I want to ask you, what, again, as when Trump talked about peace and Rabin talked about peace, it's probably a little bit two different things. So what do you see as the biggest opportunity for Israel today to reclaim this kind of peace Rabin fought for?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer. I can only say this, that Gaza, paradoxically, scene of the first Intifada, trigger on October 7 as well, is now the pathway, the only pathway to trying to create an alternative pathway for Israelis and Palestinians. that Donald Trump, and I worked and voted for Republicans and Democrats, a man who has literally undermined the norms and institutions of constitutional government and who took an inaugural oath, which he's obliged to protect these institutions, managed to do what no other American president has ever done. You'd have to go back to Eisenhower, who threatened economic and political sanctions against David Ben-Gurion if he didn't withdraw Israeli forces from Sinai. Donald Trump talked to an Israeli prime minister, pushed an Israeli prime minister, forced an Israeli prime minister to accept, obviously, what was my judgment, very pro-Israeli 20-point plan, but nonetheless one that Benjamin Netanyahu did not want to accept. That Donald Trump has now created this moment where, in fact, and I think Yael is right. I think it's more a moment than an awakening. But the fact that people are actually talking about dealing with Gaza, Palestinian governance, security in Gaza, reconstruction of Gaza, Gaza becomes the test. If Gaza works, then it's conceivable, that's about all I could say, that Gaza first will not be Gaza only. And it seems to me, because the West Bank looms here, obviously, is a huge problem. You bring international stabilization force to Gaza, what do you think the next question people are going to ask? Palestinians are going to ask, why not us? Why not protect us in the West Bank? I'm not saying this administration will go there. It probably won't. But if you can make Gaza work, who or what's going to govern there, who or what's going to guarantee security there, delivering assistance to a long-suffering population, returning the remains of the 8 Israeli hostages, deceased hostages whose bodies Hamas still holds. If you can make all that work, there may be a way to build, a bridge to something more. But it's going to depend, last comment, in memory of a man that I still mourn and who I grew to love, just as President Clinton, who wrote in his memoirs that he loved Rabin as he had loved no other man. It's going to require the one thing that is now missing, not just in Israel, by the way, but among Palestinians. Leaders who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies, leaders who are willing to incorporate in their own narratives the narratives of the people sitting across the table. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to look toward a brighter future.
Thank you so much. That was really powerful and a great, great way to finish the conversation with this kind of look ahead and what can we look for as we keep going for this work. Just want to mention before we close that we did have a few questions from the audience, but you brilliantly answered almost all of them as you were speaking. So I just want to say thank you again to Aaron and Yael. It was such a privilege to host you, and thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for all the work you do to continue carrying.
And Shimrit, thanks for hosting, and Yael, thank you for your insights, and thanks once again for J Street for marking Rabin's memory. He deserved that and much more.
Right. Thank you, J Street.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say before I close that the recording will be available later today at J Street YouTube channel, and please feel free to share it with others who might be interested. And just before we sign off, I really want to share with you like one last optimistic note that came to me as we were speaking. Those of us who live through Oslo and to the peace agreement with Jordan, and Aaron, for you also with peace with Egypt, we've witnessed how this effort for peace became a reality. It's not a dream that we're talking about. There was a moment in time that it became possible. So I think that if it was possible once, it probably can be possible again with all of our hard work together. So thank you so much for your partnership and support of J Street, and we'll see you next time. Toda rabah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.